Okay, sorry guys. So today we are looking at the end of the Cold War. So we're going to do that by kind of starting from the beginning, revising what we've looked at so far until we get up to the new stuff and looking at how the Cold War was brought to a close. We are going to be looking at some videos, some personal stories about what it was like when the Berlin Wall was torn down, etc. And then there's going to be your homework task is going to be to engage with the video as well. Taylor, could you just mute yourself, please, because we're getting a bit of noise from you. Just a reminder that there are no lessons next Thursday because the college is having a PD day, so like there was this Monday. So if you normally attend a Thursday lesson, you can come to the Monday lesson at 9:40, or you can watch the lesson recording from the Monday lesson at 9:40. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, your individual history essay plan I should have. If I don't have that and I don't have a reason from you why, then I really need to hear from you as soon as possible. They're getting looked at the moment. I'm kind of halfway through marking everything. I'm hoping to, the individual history essay plans are the ones I want to get to you the fastest because they're the ones you need to keep working on, whereas the grades from your letters and your essay test, you don't need to see that as urgently. So your individual history essay plans should all be back to you by the end of today. And then some people have already got theirs, but if you don't have it yet, you should have it by the end of the day. And then you can start working on your first draft, which is due week 8. So you've got 2 weeks to do that. Anything else? Just thinking if there's anything else before we get started. No. Okay, so let's start with, I'm going to read to you a few bits from an article, How Did the Cold War Start and End? So I'm going to kind of revise back from the beginning. So the Cold War was a geopolitical, ideological and economic struggle between two superpowers, the USA and the USSR, that started in 1947 at the end of the Second World War and lasted into the dissolution of the Soviet Union on December 26, 1991. So that's the official date that we think of when the as to when the Cold War ended. So December 26th, 1991. Hi Ben, I'm glad you made it in. We've only just gotten started. The Cold War was marked by continuous rivalry between the two former World War II allies. Conflict spanned from subtle espionage in the biggest cities of the world to violent combat in the tropical jungles of Vietnam. It ranged from nuclear submarines gliding noiselessly through the depths of the ocean to the most technologically advanced satellites in orbit in space. In basketball and hockey, in ballet and the arts, from the Berlin Wall to the movies, the political and cultural war waged by the communists and capitalists was a colossal confrontation on a scale never before seen in human history. One of the earliest events in the origin of the Cold War arose from the anti-communism remarks of British leader Winston Churchill. And what did he say? What was his famous line? Jill?
It's not complete, but an iron curtain has descended on old Europe.
Yes, excellent. So an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Excellent. Where am I? Oh, yeah. So on March 5th, 1946, in a famous speech, he said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest and Sofia, all these famous cities and populations around them, lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow." What some historians call anti-communism, others analyse as fear, because Stalin, shortly after invading Berlin, had gone on to conquer all of Eastern Europe. The Americans responded to Stalin's manoeuvres in Eastern Europe with the Marshall Plan, a generous provision of free financial aid for the reconstruction of war-torn Western Europe. The Soviets responded to the Marshall Plan with the Zhdanov Doctrine, unveiled in October of 1947. This claimed that the United States was seeking global domination through American imperialism as well as the collapse of democracy. On the other hand, according to this doctrine, the Soviet Union was intent on eliminating imperialism and the remaining traces of fascism while strengthening democracy. The Americans reacted to this with the so-called Long Telegram, written by George Kennan, who was kind of deputy chief of mission in Moscow, which said, Soviet power, unlike that of Hitlerite Germany, is neither schematic nor adventuristic. It does not work by fixed plans. It does not take unnecessary risks. Impervious to the logic of reason, and it is highly sensitive to the logic of force. For this reason, it can easily withdraw, and usually does when strong resistance is encountered at any point. So what he's saying is that we should be able to defeat the Soviet power, simply by showing strong resistance. So because of this, the US official policy became what of communism? What was their policy called? Starts with a C, Ryan?
Containment.
Excellent. So the official US policy became the containment of communism. They were going to put up a strong resistance in the hope that they would easily withdraw. So these were two nations that had never been enemies on any field and which had fought side by side during World War II, but they were now undeclared enemies in a war that would never break out in the open, but which would last for more than 50 years. In 1949, the Soviet Union developed its first atomic bomb. The confrontation between the USA and the USSR escalated to the nuclear level, and humanity trembled at the prospect of global nuclear catastrophe. And you'll remember that that's when we were only 2 minutes to midnight on the doomsday clock. Then the 1950s introduced America to one of the darkest and most liberal ideas in its political and social history. And this is something that we haven't talked about much, McCarthyism. Who has come across McCarthyism in the reading they've been doing, or perhaps Robin talked about McCarthyism? Rebecca, what do you think of when you hear McCarthyism? What do you think it is?
The history teacher at my school said it was like the McCarthy witch trials back in the later history.
Yep. So it's kind of like, yes, and comparing it to a witch hunt is quite accurate, because basically what it was a extreme fear of communism and spies, communist infiltrators, and so there was kind of this idea that there was a witch hunt going on of anyone that might be a communist sympathizer. So the government and even private enterprise recklessly accused thousands of Americans of being communists or fellow travelers and sympathizers, and subjected them to interrogation, investigation, and sanctions. The outstanding features of McCarthyism were the Hollywood blacklisting of artists and intellectuals, and the notorious hearings of the House Un-American Activities Committee. So there was this thing set up by this senator called McCarthy, and he created this committee called the House Un-American Activities Committee, so anyone conducting activities that were considered un-American. So McCarthyism became a broad political and cultural phenomenon that ultimately tarnished the benevolent global reputation of the United States. So there was this idea that the United States was a very free place, very open, very kind of friendly, and this really tarnished their reputation, the things that went on. So the Cold War continued even after McCarthyism was largely exposed as paranoia and self-serving propaganda. John F. Kennedy was elected to the presidency in 1960, and something's going on here. In 1960, and shortly after, two crises erupted. In the August of 1961, the USSR erected the Berlin Wall, designed to stem the increasing number of East Germans who were fleeing communist East Berlin to the west. The exact number will never be known, but perhaps as many as 200 East Germans were shot and killed trying to escape over the wall, and we're going to look at a couple of stories in related to that. Now, I just wanted to find... There was a propaganda video that I was going to show you, but I don't think we're going to have time. It's a bit long, so I might just send you the link later for you guys to have a watch of. There are all these kind of cartoons, you know, even like Disney produced some anti-communist propaganda cartoons. Then in 1962, what happened? What got started in 1962? What have we just been looking at? Jill?
Cuban Missile Crisis.
Excellent. So 1962 marked the Cuban Missile Crisis. So during the crisis, so the world was a breath away from nuclear war, and how close did we come? During the crisis, a captain and political officer aboard one of the Soviet subs, equipped with a nuclear missile, came to believe a nuclear war had already begun and decided to launch their nuke against the United States. The two, being in agreement, had the authority to launch. The only thing that stopped them was the vehement arguments from one man, and there's a link here to a further article about this particular person and situation, which I might send to you guys. I'm just going to open it in another tab so I can send it to you later. Excuse me. So, in 1959, Cuba had fallen over the leadership of Fidel Castro. I've lost my place. Fallen under the leadership of Fidel Castro, who had rejected American influence to ally himself with the Soviets. In the fall of 1962, American spy planes discovered that Castro was installing Soviet nuclear missiles capable of quickly striking targets in the US. The United States Navy blockaded Cuba, preventing Soviet deliveries of war materials. For a heart-stopping time, the world lurched toward nuclear war. Eventually, Soviet leader Khrushchev agreed to remove Soviet missiles on the island in exchange for the American withdrawal of equally strategically placed missiles from Turkey. Then from 1962 to 1975, the United States was involved in the war in Vietnam, where the Soviets supplied the Viet Cong with munitions, while during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan from 1979 to 1988, America supported the Afghan Mujahideen. But basically, American and Soviet soldiers never confronted one another on the battlefield. During the 60s, so basically there were two wars that mirrored each other quite similarly. So the United States Army was actually involved in the war in Vietnam, and the Soviet Union was just supplying munitions and supplies to the Viet Cong. And then when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and were actually involved in the fighting, Americans were just supporting via munitions, money, supplies, etc. So they're kind of mirror image scenarios. Then during the 60s, the space race became a much more peaceful and beneficial battlefield, this time for technological and ideological superiority. What are we talking about when I say the space race? Rebecca.
Who can get the first satellite up in space?
Sorry, just talk a bit closer to your microphone. I can't hear you.
Sorry. Who could get the first satellite in space, who could get the first man in space, the first man on the moon, and stuff like that.
Excellent, that's right. So a race to see who could advance faster in kind of space technology. So the Soviets took the lead. In 1957, they launched Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite, and maybe you've heard of Sputnik before. If anyone watches Friends, there's an episode where Ross dresses up as Sputnik, and it's a really bad costume. They followed up by shooting the first human, a man called Yuri Gagarin, into space in 1961, and the first woman in 1963. Then there was also a Soviet cosmonaut who was the first to leave his spacecraft and go for a spacewalk, almost getting stuck out there in the process. The culmination of the space race occurred on July 20th, 1969. And what happened? What was the culmination of the space race? What happened on July 20th, 1969? Does anyone know? Jill?
Armstrong walked on the moon.
Brilliant. Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. And I always love hearing my parents talk about where they were when he walked on the moon. They were at school. Jill, do you remember watching him walk on the moon? Did you watch it live? Yes. Where were you? Do you remember?
I would have been at school.
Yeah. I always think that's so cool to have been able to witness some of those big moments like that. So the US responded to the Soviet achievements with the Apollo 11 landing on the moon and Neil Armstrong's giant leap for mankind. But it was the battles between the two nations over athletics that were perhaps the most entertaining and the most harmless as well. So while there was definitely some scary and harmful things going on, there were things like the space race and things going on during the Olympics that were quite harmless and were really just about that tension and what could almost be comical. there was, except for the US boycott, so in 1980, the Olympics were in Moscow and the US boycotted. And then in 1984, the Olympics were in Los Angeles and the USSR boycotted by not attending. Most contests had some underlying political tension, but no overt political content. So everyone knew that it was really like tense about who would win, but there wasn't actually any politics involved. So there were two outstanding upsets. The first ever defeat of the United States in an Olympic basketball tournament in Germany in 1972, and then there was the defeat of the Soviet ice hockey team in the Winter Olympics, and they've both become kind of legends of pop culture. There's been movies made about them and that kind of thing. Then we started to draw towards the end. So during the 1980s, the crumbling of the economic and political structures of the Soviet Union became increasingly apparent. What do you think might have led to the crumbling of the economic and political structures, and why was America's economy still going so strong? What do we know about the difference in the way the two countries were being run? Jill?
I would say the communists were state-run and they had to foot all the bills, and American were capitalist and made lots of profit.
Excellent. So in America, there's a lot more economic drive going on. There's a lot more production, and then when there's a lot of production, people are making money and they're using that money to buy more things, and more things are being produced. Whether or not you think that capitalism leads to greed or leads to a large gap between the middle class and the upper class and the lower class, it certainly does work. History doesn't argue with that in any way. Whereas the communist method, people don't have much money to be going out and buying things and spending money on services, so then those services aren't having any money put into them, and basically everything is having to be funded by the state. People are also don't have much incentive to work very hard because there isn't any kind of improvement in their living state, in the amount of money they can make and the things they can buy. The things that they can buy are of quite poor quality, so things just started to crumble. By 1955, when Mikhail Gorbachev, and this is him on the right on our PowerPoint here on the front cover of Time magazine, who's on the left? Who recognises the guy on the left? Who knows who that is? Jaden?
Isn't that Ronald Reagan?
Excellent. Ronald Reagan on the left, and we've got Mikhail Gorbachev on the right. So by the time he came into power in 1985, the Soviet Union was embroiled in disastrous economic problems. In addition, the Soviet satellite states in Eastern Europe were abandoning communism one after the other. In 1988, the Soviet Union abandoned its 9-year war in Afghanistan. Next, Gorbachev refused to send military support to defend the previous satellite states of the USSR, greatly weakening their communist regimes. So all throughout Europe, in the various satellite states of the USSR, there was uprisings going on, and people were fighting back against the communist kind of dictatorships that were in place. And because Gorbachev refused to send in military support, most of those started to fall. This was the backdrop for Gorbachev's visit to East Berlin in the fall of 1989, where his speech advocating for freedom of communication with the West spurred popular agitation in East Germany. Demanding reunion with their families, East Berliners pulled down parts of the wall and climbed across into West Berlin. The destruction of the Berlin Wall, of great symbolic importance, finished off the Iron Curtain, and the following year saw the reunification of Germany. So that was one of the big symbols. Although technically the Cold War didn't end until 1991, many people see the fall of the Berlin Wall as the symbolic end. That same year, the Russian Confederation convened a new Congress, electing Boris Yeltsin as president and passing laws that ousted the Soviets from Russia. This kind of political and legal instability, I'm just going to go across another slide. So we have here Gorbachev and Reagan again. This kind of political and legal instability continued throughout 1990 and 1991 as many of the Soviet republics gradually became de facto independent. Most of the Allied and pro-Soviet regimes in Eastern Europe finally collapsed, and Gorbachev wanted to end the Cold War. Horrified by these developments, in August of 1991, extremist elements among the remaining communist leaders confined Gorbachev to house arrest in his dacha in the Crimea in what became known as the August coup. What's a coup? C-O-U-P, it's spelled. Ryan?
Is it an overthrow or something?
Yeah, it's kind of like a rebellion, like you're trying to overthrow usually the government in some way. But this Boris Yeltsin whipped up a violent resistance in Moscow, blockading the conspirators' military vehicles. He even persuaded the commander of a tank battalion to side with the Russians against the Soviets, at one point standing on a tank to address the crowds. The coup was suppressed and Yeltsin was hailed as a hero. The failure of the August coup marked the end of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin entered into agreements with the leaders of other Soviet republics for the dissolution of the USSR, replacing it in December of 1991 with a Commonwealth of Independent States. On December 25th, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was still the highest Soviet official, officially recognized the bankruptcy and collapse of the Soviet Union. The USSR was dissolved. The extremely powerful socialist state on the Eurasian continent that had influenced world history from 1922 to 1991 disappeared forever, and the Cold War finally came to an end. So what we have going on in this picture as well, actually I'm going to come back to that because we're going to look at some stories from the Berlin Wall. So what I would like you to do is I'm going to send you a link in the chat window. If you scroll down, you're going to scroll down through quite a bit of writing. About halfway down the page, you're going to come to a video. And the video, actually it's more than halfway. The video is called Time Remembers the Day the Berlin Wall Fell. So have a watch of that video and then put up a green tick when you're finished. Okay, so you've seen a little bit about what it looks like when the wall was coming down. Let's hear about what it was like when it first went up. So 1961, the wall went up very quickly. There was pretty much no warning at all that it was going up. It was just less a wall and more of a fence, and it really startled pretty much the whole world. For nearly a decade, Berlin, a divided city situated between the eastern portion of a divided country, had been the easiest way to cross between East Germany to the west, but the East had been facing a dwindling population and took drastic measures despite earlier promises to preserve freedom of movement. And here's a quote. The screams of sirens and the clank of steel on cobblestones echoed down the mean, dark streets. Frightened East Berliners peeked from behind their curtains to see military convoys stretching for blocks. First came the motorcycle outriders, then jeeps, trucks and buses crammed with grim, steel-helmeted East German troops. Rattling in their wake were the tanks, squat Russian-built T-34s and T-54s. At each major intersection, a platoon peeled off and ground to a halt, guns at the ready. The rest headed on for the sector border, the 25-mile frontier that cuts through the heart of Berlin like a jagged piece of glass. As the troops arrived at scores of border points, cargo trucks were already unloading rolls of barbed wire, concrete posts, wooden horses, stone blocks, picks and shovels. When dawn came 4 hours later, a wall divided East Berlin from West for the first time in 8 years. Later in 1962, protests erupted, sparked by cruel treatment of an attempted escapee named Peter Fetscher, who was shot and left to bleed in the no man's land between the two sides. At the time, Time magazine explored whether extended violence and further protest was likely to become a constant in the divided city. And here's the quote. In flat, open country within the city's northern boundary, the land to the west is checkered with brown wheat fields and lush green potato gardens. Eastward stretches a no man's land where once fertile fields lie desolate and deathly still. They could be in two different worlds, and in a sense they are. Even the countryside outside Berlin is divided into east and west by a vicious, impenetrable hedge of rusty barbed wire and concrete. As it snakes southward toward the partitioned city, it becomes the wall. Seldom in history have blocks and mortar been so malevolently employed or so richly hated in return. 1 year old this month, the Wall of Shame, as it is often called, cleaves Berlin's war-scarred face like an unhealed wound. Its hideousness offends the eye as its inhumanity hurts the heart. For 27 miles it coils through the city, amputating proud squares and busy thoroughfares, marching insolently across graveyards and gardens, dividing families and friends, transforming whole street fronts into bricked-up blankness. The wall, muses a Berlin policeman, is not just sad, it is not just ridiculous, it is schizophrenic. On the 25th anniversary of the wall's construction, Time checked in on the city and found that Germans on the two sides of the wall had evolved into two very different groups of people. So the wall was up for about 30 years. And that's a really long time. West Berlin was more modern, East Berlin was quieter, their economies were distinct, but Berliners from both sides still harboured hopes that they would one day be reunited. Even with a quarter century of division under their belt, they felt that they could all get along. So who here is, the majority of people in this lesson are going to be under 25. I just turned 25. So there would have been plenty of people born during that time that had never lived in a time when you could cross over into the other half of the city, when there wasn't this huge wall looming down the middle of the place you lived. And here's the quote. West Berliners had managed to make an uneasy peace with the monstrous wall. Almost every Berliner's emotional survival kit includes a wisecracking sense of humour. Standard encounter. An American, returning to Berlin after 60 years, asks his taxi driver to run down the events during his absence. Responds the driver, the Nazis came, the war came, the Russians came, you didn't miss much. No less modern are the graffiti spray painted on the western side of the wall. And who's maybe seen you might have seen some kind of iconic images of the spray painting on the wall. Things like, all in all, you're just another brick in the wall, reads one bit of wisdom. Donald Duck for president, declares another. One of the newest decorations is a purple cake divided in two by a brown wall. The inscription, Happy 25th Birthday. There are no clever messages on the eastern side of the wall. East German officials regard the barricade with pride. To celebrate its anniversary, they plan to stage a parade and have already issued a commemorative postage stamp. Since its construction, says Karl-Heinz Gummich, a representative in the East German Tourist Office, the economy has grown strong, relations with West Germany have been stabilised, and the threat of war has been removed, which of course is completely ridiculous because the economy was not strong, it was terribly weak, and relations, they were very poor. I'm going to skip this one. Okay, I'm going to go to freedom. So 1989, November 20th. Until the wall fell at midnight on November 9th, 89, losing its power as suddenly as it had gone up, though it would take many months for the concrete to be dismantled. Time had been planning to run a cover story about the election of the first black governor in the United States. But then came the stunning announcement that East Germans would be allowed to travel through the Berlin Wall and would be granted freer elections as well. And so they decided to change the cover, and the result was 12 pages of reporting and photography, history as it was made each day and each week. And here's the quote. What happened in Berlin last week was a combination of the fall of the Bastille and a New Year's Eve blowout of revolution and celebration. At the stroke of midnight on November 9th, a date that not only Germans would remember, thousands who had gathered on both sides of the wall let out a roar and started going through it as well as up and over. West Berliners pulled East Berliners to the top of the barrier, along which in years past many an East German had been shot while trying to escape. At times the wall almost disappeared beneath waves of humanity. They tooted trumpets and danced on the top. They brought out hammers and chisels and whacked away at the hated symbol of imprisonment, knocking loose chunks of concrete and waving them triumphantly before television cameras. They spilled out into the streets of West Berlin for a champagne-spraying, horn-honking bash that continued well past dawn into the following day and then another dawn. As the daily BZ, so like the newspaper in Berlin, would headline, "Berlin is Berlin again." And here's, come back, here's the front page, Berlin Wall tumbles in the London Herald. And here's people sitting on top of the wall. People started to collect bits of the Berlin Wall. I actually have an uncle who has a piece of the Berlin Wall, and they were being sold. You can probably still buy bits of the Berlin Wall on eBay now, I imagine. Okay, now let's go back to these images. There's a bit of a timeline here. So here's a timeline of the end of the Cold War, and you may need to, I don't know if you're going to need to zoom or not. Okay, so we've got maps here with a key showing what's going on. So this was kind of the fall of the Soviet satellite states. So in 1989 in Poland, the Solidarity Party sweeps elections. That was a Democratic Party. In Czechoslovakia, communist leadership was ousted in 89. In Germany, the Berlin Wall was breached in 89. In Yugoslavia, the country disintegrates and civil war begins in 92. In Romania, communist dictator Ceausescu, who was an incredibly notoriously cruel and brutal leader, was overthrown and executed. That was 1989. And in Lithuania, in 1990, they declared independence. In 1990, Latvia and Estonia began to separate from the Soviet Union. In Hungary, free elections were held and non-communists swept into power in 1990. In Bulgaria, government pledges free elections and new constitution in 1990. Free elections sweep non-communists into power. In Albania, free elections sweep non-communists into power and the Soviet Union dissolved December 1991. Russia and 10 former Soviet republics form Commonwealth of Independent States. And that's countries like Estonia, Latvia, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, etc. So you can see all of these, the buffer zone that Russia had created in the green, and pretty much all of them fell within that kind of 2-year period, 89, 90. Okay. Here we have, now you saw these, because I did have them up before. Who knows what is going on? Who knows what happened on the 8th of December, 1987? What are they signing here? Does anyone know? Has anyone come across that? So they're signing the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. So the INF Treaty was the first arms control pact to require an actual reduction in nuclear arsenals rather than merely restricting their proliferation. So it considerably decreased the amount of nuclear weapons that both the USSR and the USA could have. Okay, so let's just review. What I have is in front of me is the SAFE Stage 2 workbook. And the kind of key points for the collapse of communism and its consequences. So Soviet power declined throughout the 1970s and 1980s, and this was due to many factors. So the Soviet Union was unable to provide consumer benefits to the people of the USSR and Warsaw Pact countries. The influx of Western consumerism through tourism and television revealed the differences in standards of living between the West and the East and made the people of Eastern Europe restive. The Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia caused a loss of support for Western European communist parties because they were identified as being in league with a tyrannical regime. What's a tyrannical regime? Ryan?
Is it an autocratic regime?
Sorry, can you repeat?
Is it an autocratic regime?
Yeah, it's an autocratic regime, so it's kind of a regime. Usually you might refer to, I guess, a dictatorship might be tyrannical. A tyrant is someone, Taylor, it doesn't look like your sound is working at all. Hang on, who's just speaking to me in chat? No, here we go. Can you hear me now, Taylor? Because your little headset disappeared before, like you couldn't hear me at all. Yeah, so a tyrannical leader or a tyrannical regime is someone that's kind of quite cruel, bossy, very strict, their way or the highway. Ronald Reagan was elected as President of the United States, and he identified the Soviet Union as the evil empire. His renewed emphasis on military spending, including the Star Wars concept, which was the idea that we'd fight wars in space, that didn't go very well, forced the USSR into increased military spending which they couldn't afford. This forced the Soviet leader Gorbachev to seek disarmament, armament talks with Reagan, I'm not speaking very well, and ease the Cold War. The people of Eastern Europe grew increasingly restive. So this began with the workers at Gdansk in Poland protesting over rising costs. The Solidarity movement followed with the establishment of an independent trade union, and the Soviet Union was unwilling or unable to suppress these riots in Poland. So what we've got so far, we've got 4 points so far. Soviet Union wasn't able to provide consumer benefits. So there was all this Western consumerism came through tourism and television. It revealed the difference in the standards of living. So people in communist countries began to realize that people in non-communist countries were really living much better lives than them and had access to better services, better products. Then the Soviets made themselves look really bad by invading Czechoslovakia. Ronald Reagan was elected president. He increased military spending, which forced the USSR to do the same, but they really couldn't afford it. Then the people of Western Europe, they started to grow restive, so they were starting to get starting to be riots and protests and things like that. Then a Polish pope was elected, and he paid his first visit to his native Poland. This pope was a hardline conservative and spoke out on human rights issues. On his visit to Poland, the authorities were powerless to stop the adulating crowd, so he spoke out on human rights issues. Through death or resignation, hardline communist leaders were replaced with more realistic communist leaders, for example, Gorbachev. So the chief amongst these new leaders, he was the General Secretary of the USSR, and he issued a policy of glasnost, which is self-criticism, and perestroika, which is restructuring. And they're two key words when we're discussing what ended the Cold War. So glasnost, self-criticism, and perestroika, restructuring. And met with Reagan to embark on a series of arms control agreements. Under glasnost and perestroika, Russians were free to openly discuss their history. Mistakes of the past were freely admitted, and dissidents were free from prison and exile and allowed to openly criticize government and society. Now that might just sound like something that we didn't need a policy of, that you were free to openly discuss your history and mistakes of the past were freely admitted. But that was not something that had ever occurred in the USSR, and it was not something that had really occurred in Russia at all for quite a period of time. And that's kind of all so then the end of communism in Eastern Europe and the investment for survival. So the communist command economies were increasingly unable to keep up with the modernizing countries in the West. Before the collapse of communism, trading did occur between capitalist and communism countries. To attract investment from the West, communist countries had to free up their economies and society. And this was particularly necessary in Asian communist countries, and that started to bring the downfall of some of the communist parties in the smaller Southeast Asian countries. So, consequences of the collapse. I'm going to cover these points and then we're done. You've been doing some really good listening, so thanks for letting me do mainly lecture today. So USA. Since the demise of the Soviet Union, the USA has become the sole dominant superpower. This is evident in its dominant influence in NATO, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the spread of its multinational enterprises, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, etc., the influence of the American dollar in world currency markets, its leadership as a force in world peacekeeping movements, its actions to quash opposition, particularly those branded as terrorists, its technical superiority. So the USA invented the World Wide Web, they've got leaders in space technology and weaponry. Consequences for Russia. So Mikhail Gorbachev was the architect of glasnost, openness, and perestroika restructuring, which promised and delivered an end to communism in Eastern European countries, including Russia. The constitution was changed, and a new president was voted in. Soon after, Marxism was rejected as the official ideology of the state. And soon after this, the Communist Party was abolished. Some former Soviet states were granted their independence. A market economy was established. Freedom of religion and the press was instituted. The old hammer and sickle flags and other symbols were removed, and democratic elections were established. Russia was admitted as an observer to NATO and the G7 economic grouping of Western economies, which includes, who wants to have a guess of what 7 economic, the other economic group, the other Western economies are? Jill?
UK?
Yes?
Or Europe, I suppose.
The countries from Europe, so not Europe as a whole, it's countries. So we've got the UK. So it's the G8 now, when we hear about the G8 summit. So it was the G7 at the time before Russia was admitted. So we've got Great Britain. Who else do you think is in? Who else is in the G8? So we've got Great Britain and we've got Russia. Jaden. Sorry, Jaden, go ahead.
Japan.
Yes, Japan.
With the yen. China, I think.
Not China. So we've got USA, Great Britain, Japan, Russia. 4 more.
The United States, obviously.
Yep.
Australia, I think. So.
Oh, not Australia, no. Okay, we've got a couple other people with hands up. Jason? Germany, he said. Yep, definitely Germany. Ben, what about you?
Canada and Italy.
Canada and Italy. Okay, so now you hear, I think that now it's like the G20 summit or something like that. It's now G20, and Australia is one of them now. It became the G8 at the time. So it was Russia, USA, Great Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Japan, and Canada, and that shows us kind of what the main powers were at the time. Okay, and I think we might leave it there. There's some more about capitalist economies, about the International Monetary Fund, but we might touch on that. I'm going to touch on that next week instead. So any questions about the collapse of the Cold War? Any questions about anything we've talked about today? Okay, any questions about the individual history essay, about any other assignments that you might have outstanding? Jill?
I'm still working on my plan, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I hope to get it to you by the end of the weekend.
Okay. I hope that you are thinking, I hope that it is manageable. I hope you haven't chosen something that's not going to be manageable.
Yeah, I'm trying to downscale it.
Okay, good. Okay, excellent. Rebecca?
When was the final for the individual history essay due in?
It's due week 1 of term 4. The final copy of your individual history essay is due at the end of week 1, term 4. Ryan?
Will you be sending out any files of what you've talked about today?
Yes, what I'm going to send you, now I did send out a link a while ago of the Crash Course World History John Green video on the Cold War, and it wasn't really homework, it was more just a suggestion to watch it. So what I've actually done is turned it into a homework task. I'm going to have you guys do that now. What I'm going to do is send you the link now. So, just give me a second. Okay, so here's the link. And you need this code. And I'll put this on Daymap for you guys as well and send it in an email. So basically, I don't know if anyone's used Edpuzzle before, but you'll need to create an account. You'll be asked if you're a teacher or a student. You say that you're a student. You click on the link, so you create your username and password. When you're logged in, it's going to ask you for a class code, and you enter that class code, and then you'll be able to view any videos and assignments that I put up for your class. So basically, it's a video, and it'll stop if you go and ask you to answer questions, and I'll be able to see the answers that you've given to the questions. And I mean, well, basically we have 2 weeks doing the end of the Cold War, Ryan, so I probably won't send out anything else this week apart from that Edpuzzle video. Next week, it'll be, there's going to be some other revision activities, basically. The lesson itself, I don't want to lecture too much, so, because I've pretty much done that this entire lesson, so next week we're going to be doing more kind of activities, answering questions, looking at some videos and things like that. Okay, any last questions before we go? Okay, all right. See you, Ben. Have a great week.